Okay, this lecture is about Parkinson's disease and what you can do to reduce your risk of Parkinson's disease and some things you can do to also help improve the course of your disease and potentially, hopefully, slow down the progression of the disease. Parkinson's disease was described in 1817 by Parkinson, and that was sort of at the time of England's industrial expansion. And Parkinson's appears to be primarily a man-made based disease. And by that I mean it tends to cluster around industrial populations. Rural populations tend to have lower rates of Parkinson's unless they're exposed to mitochondrial pesticides. So some of the farming communities where they work with pesticides all the time, they have high incidence of Parkinson's disease. If you look at the global distribution of disease, very easy to do, just type that into your browser, global distribution of Parkinson's disease. What you'll see is it pretty much matches autoimmune diseases, which means relatively northern industrialized societies that eat a lot of meat. Okay? This might indicate that autoimmune diseases, by the way, tend to be associated with leaky gut. Basically, plant food with a lot of fiber. The fiber feeds the good gut bacteria. They maintain the intestinal lining. The lining is called the enteric tract, so the lining cells are called the enterocytes. They use fiber, the good gut bacteria, to make butyric acid, 4-carbon, carboxylic acid, fatty acid, and that's how the tight junctions are made to prevent bacteria, large pieces of protein, LPS from gram-negative bacterial walls from getting through the intestinal wall barrier. Also, taking good care of your teeth is a good way to prevent leaky gums, so to speak, whereby bacteria and other chemicals get into your blood. And their point being is they can cause cross-reactivity through autoantibodies that bind to the large animal protein and then subsequently also react against the body's own tissue, because animal proteins are similar to the human proteins. They're amino acid sequences. So these are some of the things that cause leaky gut, meat and oils. All right, what prevents leaky gut? Starch, because it's got the fiber, and then it doesn't have the sat fat. Saturated fat causes leaky gut. Okay, what's the Brock hypothesis? Brock was a pathologist who in Europe who did lots of autopsies on Parkinson's patients and non-Parkinson patients, and he looked for the Lewy bodies. Lewy bodies are sort of the signature pathological mark of Parkinson's when you look at down a microscope, and they're made largely out of a protein called alpha-synuclein. And as it turns out, Brock saw a pattern whereby the Lewy bodies would seem to start in the olfactory nerve, which means the nose. Olfactory means sense of smell. ENS means enteric nervous system. And he noticed a pattern. It would seem that it would tend to start in the intestinal tract and then spread through the vagus nerve all the way up, vagal nerve up to the brain, dorsal motor vagus nerve, nucleus, and then subsequently to substantia nigra. Substantia nigra just means black stuff in like Latin. All right, and that's where you mostly have your dopamine neurons. So the Brock hypothesis was very useful because it provided a way to see the big picture, so to speak, of Parkinson's disease. By the way, I think Parkinson's is actually more than one disease, just so you know that, because there's lumpers and splitters. I'm a bit of a splitter when it comes to the pathology of Parkinson's, and there's a reason why I'll say that. We'll go into that in a moment. And I think that Brock's hypothesis is very helpful, and there's a lot of experimental evidence to support it. There's other experimental evidence that doesn't support it so well in some cases. At autopsy, when you look at the brains of Parkinson's patients after they died, they'll see these Lewy bodies, and they'll see them, in the brainstem. They'll see them in other parts of the brain as well. About 80% of these patients will also have some of the pathological hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease with beta amyloid plaques and with neurofibrillary tangles. Beta amyloid is the amyloid protein extracellular associated with Alzheimer's, and tau, hyperphosphorylated tau proteins that make the neurofibrillary tangles intracellular are also associated with Alzheimer's. And the point I'm trying to make, the big debate in neurodegeneration circles is, are these inclusion bodies, Lewy bodies and the beta amyloid, senile plaques, neurofibrillary tangles, are they the disease itself, or are they simply a marker of dead cells, like tombstones, if you will, after the fact? Okay? Let's see, next topic is mitochondrial toxins. Sometimes it appears to be caused, like I said, due to some of these mitochondrial pesticides like rotenone, paraquat, MPTP. That's the famous one that was made as accidentally with some designer drugs. Famous stories about that if you look it up in Parkinson's. Heptachlor is another pesticide that famously, all these things, you want to be careful avoiding pesticides. That's another reason why you only want to eat organic food. It's not perfect, but it has a lot less pesticides than non-organic food. That's also why you don't want to live next to a farm where the farmer's spraying that crap every day, okay? A couple decades of exposure to that, you end up with Parkinson's disease. Michael J. Fox was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease when he was only 29 years old. And the point being is, it's not due to atherosclerosis. 29-year-olds don't have that bad of atherosclerosis yet because they still have a lot of reserve endothelial precursor cells, good elastic fibers in their ascending thoracic aorta, so they don't get that bad of an atherosclerosis typically. And apparently it was a cluster of patients in Canada, suggesting to me it was probably a toxic exposure to my best guess from what I read about it. So what that means is you yourself be careful to avoid stuff. Always filter your water. There's so much stuff in the water. It's unbelievable. Go study water for a while. How much toxic stuff's in water if you don't filter it? You'd be amazed. All right. I won't even drink water unless it's reverse osmosis filtered. And I don't even drink that much water. I mostly mix it in my food, like let's say in my oatmeal or something. You'll get plenty of it that way. In your rice, you get plenty of it that way. Okay. Exercise. Exercise does a lot of good things for the brain. It increases mitochondrial biogenesis. What that means is your mitochondria, your energy producing factories inside your cells, they're dynamic. When you exercise more, your body says, okay, I need to make more energy, so it makes more mitochondria. You want more mitochondria. You're building reserve. They increase a chemical called brain-derived neurotropic growth factor. They also can build new neurons, and you can even build some new neurons in the substantia nigra. People think of the hippocampus and the area along the ventricle, subventricular zone as the primary areas where new neurons can continue to develop in adults. That's what neurogenesis is. But they can also occur to a lesser extent in the substantia nigra, so you might as well get what you can regenerating the substantia nigra. Angiogenesis just means to provide blood vessels to help those new neurons function. Pamela Quinn's a famous ballerina lady, and you can check her out on the internet. I was impressed by her and her ideas about how to optimize physical movement in Parkinson patients. Parkinson patients should pretty much exercise as much as possible. We talked about Parkinson's being in part due to mitochondrial dysfunction. You want to avoid eating meat because of the saturated fat, fructose because it gets made into saturated fat, alcohol because it gets made into saturated fat because they all cause mitochondrial dysfunction. In this book I wrote about a year ago, How to Reduce Risk of Cancer and Chronic Disease, I go into a lot of the complicated stuff about understanding the pathophysiology of neurodegeneration, if you're actually interested in that. You don't need to know all that, by the way. That's only somebody who really is kind of obsessive and nerdy, but what you need to know mostly is what we're talking about here. Substantia nigra in the brain, of the midbrain, has glucose type 4 transporters. It also has, of course, glucose type 1 and glucose type 2, but the important point for our discussion is it has glucose type 4 transporters. What that means is it's similar to like what the skeletal muscle has in that sense, and that it's vulnerable to insulin resistance. So you don't want to be eating anything that's going to cause insulin resistance, which means all these things that cause saturated fat, to get the most function out of your mitochondria. You want high functioning mitochondria because that's where your ATP is made. That's where your energy comes from. That's one of the worst problems in Parkinson's, is a lack of energy for motor movement. So keep your mitochondria happy. Eat a plant-based organic starch diet. You want organic because that way there's less pesticides, less potential mitochondrial toxins in there. Okay, what else do we know about the substantia nigra? Well, the brain has about 100 billion neurons, depending on how you count them, but 100 billion neurons, but only about 400,000 dopamine neurons. And that means there's very few of them, and they're very precious. Each individual dopamine neuron can have like 1 million synapses. That's not a misprint. 1 million synapses. So what does that mean? They need tons and tons of energy. What is the best form of energy for the brain? Glucose. What is starch? Starch is a polymer of glucose. That's why these people should be eating starch. And then the fiber causes a slow absorption effect, like a slow energy release pill. It's a perfect food for humans. All right. And the reason why the brain has to burn glucose for energy is you can burn glucose very quickly and produce tons of energy from it. You can't get energy that fast from burning fats. Typical fatty acid is going to be metabolized through beta oxidation. Beta oxidation, number one, it requires about 15 to 20% more oxygen to burn the fat in the first place. So you increase the oxygen demand. A lot of these are older people with baseline atherosclerotic disease. Number two, it's slow to produce energy, and it quite often doesn't work as well as you'd like, let's say in the hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, and the substantia nigra. You want to burn glucose from starch. That optimizes brain function. You want to avoid things like sodium. Vasoconstrictors are going to decrease blood supply to the brain. You want to avoid things like MSG, aspartame, excess calcium intake, because those are potential excitotoxins, increasing metabolic demands, and it's hard to meet those metabolic demands. When a neuron can't meet its metabolic demands, it might go into apoptosis and die. You don't want that. Okay, what else is interesting? We talked about in my last video on why do people become demented and what you can do to prevent it. Obstructive sleep apnea. Fat person, they often have sleep apnea and they're hypoxic. Not good. Neurons die when they're hypoxic. What you're trying to do, by the time a person symptomatically presents with motor symptoms from Parkinson's disease, they've usually lost 60 to 70% of their neurons. So there's precious few remaining dopamine neurons. You want to keep them healthy and alive. Give them good food, starch. Give them good oxygen. Don't be fat. How do you avoid being fat? Look around the world. Who's skinny? All the people that eat starch, okay? All the populations where almost everybody's skinny, they eat starch. Look at an old Bruce Lee movie, okay? Chinese Connection or something. All the people, a bunch of people eating rice, they're all skinny, okay? Keep that in mind. Look at the Okinawans, 85% of the calories from sweet potatoes. That's how you stay skinny. When you're skinny, you got a smaller body to move. You can move a 150-pound body around a lot easier than you can a 250-pound person who's overweight, and they're going to have more arthritis in that case as well. What else to know about? We talked about alpha-synuclein. Alpha-synuclein is the main protein associated with Lewy bodies, and that's the one too. Johns Hopkins Hospital, by the way, they injected alpha-synuclein, a precipitated form of it, into the gut wall, and it spread through the vagus nerve up to the brain. And that's also thought to be an example of what is called Prion Disease. A Prion Disease is like a protein infection that's able to self-propagate. All right, and they think that this might in part be a Prion Disease. I'm not so sure about that, but it might be. The guy who's most interesting to talk about prions is Douglas Kell. Douglas Kell has a fantastic lecture on the internet, about an hour long, where he believes that oxidative stress, which means like reactive oxygens, like hydroxyl radicals, for example, initiated by free iron. Iron normally should be bound to enzymes. That would be called liganded. To be liganded is to be bound to an enzyme. Iron is very helpful in the active part of enzymes because it's a transitional metal. It has a variable valence, meaning it has a variable electrical charge. Typically we think of iron as being Fe2+ or Fe3+. The point being is in the active site of an enzyme it can hand off electrons quite readily, and therefore it's great when it's under the control of an enzyme. But if iron gets free, where do you get high amounts of iron? Careful with those multivitamins. A lot of them contain iron. You don't want to be high iron. Men don't menstruate, okay? If you're eating meat or you're taking multivitamins with iron, your iron level is probably way too high and you're going to have more and more free iron. Also, if you have fatty liver, you're going to have liver cells dying, and when they die, they release tons of iron into the blood. Bad. Because iron, when it's by itself, not bound to an enzyme, it can become what is called autocatalytic, and that can help to run something called the Fenton reaction, whereby you're producing free radical oxygen species. A free radical oxygen species is one that has an unpaired electron in its outer shell, and that becomes hyperreactive, and it can initiate a cascade of chemical reactions that are damaging to cell membranes, and the similar process can be damaging to your brain cells. And this whole process can also cause the reactivation of dormant bacteria. Everybody's got some dormant bacteria in their blood. Douglas Kell discusses this the best. He goes into all this detail in the research of it. But the point being is, how does the human body prevent dormant bacteria from being reactivated? By sequestering iron. When you have free iron in your blood, dormant bacteria can become reactivated. Some of those dormant bacteria can release a toxin from their cell wall, like gram-negative rods have an LPS toxin in their cell wall. LPS means lipopolysaccharide, and very small, minuscule amounts of lipopolysaccharide can cause the blood to be hypercoagulable and can also precipitate some of these brain proteins like beta amyloid, which is classically associated with Alzheimer's disease, but it's potentially a relevant mechanism for precipitation of alpha-synuclein protein in Parkinson's disease. Alpha-synuclein, even though it's an intracellular protein, it potentially can be expelled into the extracellular space when in some of these Parkinson cells, substantia nigra and whatnot. Okay, so what am I talking about? A prion is a self-propagating protein. So normally, under normal conditions, that protein structure will be alpha helix, like a helix. These are secondary structures of protein. This is pretty standard stuff in any textbook on biochemistry, for example. Common secondary structure of proteins is alpha helix, and they can then be switched, the prion form, into a beta-pleated sheet, which is a flat protein. The problem with flat proteins, beta-pleated sheet, is they can stack up one upon the other and form insoluble aggregates. The bigger a molecule bound to itself, a compound is, the more likely it is to precipitate, become insoluble. A protein has to be soluble in order to be functional. Once it's insoluble, it is no longer functional. So what I'm basically saying is, you don't want high levels of iron in your blood. Okay, you're reactivating dormant bacteria, you're causing generalized inflammation, you're potentially going to cause a dementia-producing precipitation of your brain proteins like beta amyloid, alpha-synuclein. And how do you avoid that? Number one, if your iron levels in your blood are high, you can donate blood. I know some genius-type doctors, and that's what they do. They donate blood about every 4 to 6 months. I'm actually thinking about doing it. My iron levels aren't so bad, but people who eat meat, or if they take a multivitamin with iron, they tend to become iron overloaded with time and more at risk for this oxidative stress. In addition, like I said, you prevent the dormant bacteria from being reactivated by sequestering iron. You've got to watch out for fatty liver. Fatty liver, you'll have liver cells die. Liver cells store a lot of iron. They release it into the blood at that time. But if I was a Parkinson's patient and I wanted to keep my brain function, motor function as long as possible, I would want iron levels low. Now, I'm not sure what's the best level to have of your blood ferritin. Ferritin is an iron storage protein that should be intracellular, not in the blood. When it's in the blood, it's a sign you're having necrosis of cells releasing iron into the blood. Okay, but to donate blood is one thing you can do about that. And also stop eating meat. Don't take a multivitamin with iron in it. Another thing about these Parkinson patients, they'll often have sleep problems, and that's why I have a little bit of difficulty accepting this idea. Oh, if you read any of these books, you'll say, oh, you know, for Parkinson's disease, caffeine is good, and so are smoking cigarettes. Yeah, right. I don't believe it. I'll tell you why. These patients got trouble sleeping. You're going to tell me that taking stimulants helps them to sleep? Bullshit, okay? I don't believe that. All right, you need to sleep. If you're drinking caffeine or you're smoking cigarettes, nicotine basically does the same thing. They activate the acute stress response. Plus, what else does catecholamines do? What are catecholamines? Adrenaline, noradrenaline. They are siderophores. What is a siderophore? A siderophore is a molecule that facilitates transfer of iron to bacteria. So they're going to increase the likelihood of activating your bacteria and potentially releasing LPS and causing precipitation of your alpha-synucleins and your beta amyloids. Doesn't sound like a good idea to me. What about increasing cortisol associated with acute stress response, associated with caffeine and nicotine? Guess what? Cortisol increases blood glucose level. It increases insulin resistance. It predisposes a diabetic. What does diabetes do? Like type 3 Alzheimer's, it decreases blood supply to the brain, like a hippocampus, for example, okay? You don't want that. You want optimal glucose supply to the brain. So I think that sounds to me like a bad idea. Oh, what about spices? That's another thing you're going to say. Oh, recommend this spice. Oh, I don't believe it. To me, it sounds like BS. Okay, a lot of these spices, read about the toxicology of food stuff, and you'll see a lot of these spices are associated with heavy levels of lead contamination or other heavy metals. Be careful with your spices. If you get them, make sure they're from a high quality source and they're not contaminated by other things. Otherwise, you just make more problems for yourself. When I think about how do you get the brain to function well, I want good blood supply. I want good nutrient delivery of glucose to my brain cells. That's the populations with the healthiest brains.